LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat and my guest today is Bonny Casel, who joins us to discuss plant consciousness and the quantum realm. Research has revealed that plants see, hear, smell, feel and communicate in profound ways, but yet mainstream science refuses to acknowledge that plants are conscious life forms, mainly because they do not have a recognizable brain. However, humans evolved within the vibrational field of plants for millions of years, a vibrational field predominantly arising from plant consciousness. Quantum theory provides a meaningful understanding of how the many perfected qualities of consciousness, represented vibrationally in the plant world, provide healing on physical, emotional, mental, and intuitive levels through vibrational entrainment and emergent behaviours. This wide-ranging talk also takes in the role of plants in human evolution, the pharmaceutical industry and its demonization of natural health care, the GMO agenda, and our deep disconnect with nature and where it is leading us individually and as a species. Hello and welcome, Bonny, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Oh, thank you, Greg. It's lovely to be here, and thank you for inviting me.
Bonny, today we're going to talk a little bit about the plant world and human relationship with it over the millennia, interaction with it, its vital importance to all life on Earth, and ultimately, Earth as a holistic system. Before we dive into all that, just tell listeners a little bit about your background and your work in general.
All right. I've had a kind of interesting background for the work that I've done as it's evolved. As I grew up in a household with two very different approaches towards understanding life. My stepfather was taught at the Department of Applied Mathematics and Theoretical Physics at Cambridge. And as I was growing up, I had a lot of opportunities to eavesdrop on his colleagues discussing physics, primarily physics, but also fractal geometry and other areas of interest like that, and also the scientific method, its strengths and weaknesses. So I had a background on that front that was really exploratory and opened my eyes a great deal to what is matter, what is consciousness, and the relationship between the two. And then my mother was a naturopath and master herbalist who cured herself of cancer when I was 5 years old. I was quite young. And so I grew up in an environment where she was really exploring that world, and she created a school in England in the 70s that taught naturopathy, herbal medicine, iridology, and brought the main teachers from around the world to speak at conferences. And so I got to listen in to amazing people as I was growing up and learn at a very deep level the effects, of plant medicine, the relationship between the mind and body in terms of healing. At a stage back when, before psychoneuroimmunology had really developed, it was still considered an Eastern view of how health and disease exists in the body. So through the years, I've worked, I've studied myself, become a naturopath. I've been teaching since 1987, and I have my own school where I teach students from around the world. And it's evolved, these two lines of questioning and discovery and research, and sort of brought me to where I am today, and which is really quantum botanicals. It's one field. They relate so completely to one another, the mind-body aspect of healing, the understanding that we are in a vibrational universe, and that our consciousness precedes matter, and precedes health conditions in the body, and our emotional and mental well-being as well.
For most people, their ideas about or relationship with, if they even think they have one, with the plant world is very matter of fact. For most of us, we think of it as source of food, perhaps of gentrification, like trees, flowers, planted in city centres to sort of brighten them up a bit. Perhaps you go for a walk in the woods or the countryside and it's a pleasant environment. Sometimes plants are seen as even just in the way, something to be gotten rid of in order to make way for other human activity. We think of the clearing of the Amazon, for example. But your contention is that, as with all life on Earth, there is a degree of consciousness within the plant world. And this is something that's going to strike a lot of people as rather strange, because they think, when they think of consciousness, if they do at all, it's very much about sentient creatures, human in nature or animal, or even, fish, insect, bird, whatever it happens to be. But the plant world is it's alive, but it's not alive, if you see what I mean. So perhaps for people to whom this idea of plant consciousness is very new and startling, perhaps you could just explain a little bit more about how you think that works.
Basically what modern biologists, their view is that as plants don't have a brain, they don't have consciousness. So even though plants see, hear, feel, taste, touch, experience all of the senses that we do, and sometimes in far greater capacity in these ways than we do as human beings, the idea is that because they don't have a brain, there's no conscious awareness of these. There's no sense of self and other in a conscious way. However, what physics has shown us is that our own brains are just as much illusory in the terms of, the concept of what is matter. It's just as vibrational as any other part of the physical body, the emotional body, the mental body. And yet consciousness itself and awareness of self and other precedes you could say, quantum collapse of the material world. So the fact that plants have an awareness of self and other, the fact that they interact with the world around them, reveals that they don't have this sort of consciousness that we perceive. And when understood from that perspective of vibration, the communication that they have with the world and the way that they experience the world is a vibrational one, just as ours is. It's just that we decode it with a brain, and they decode it in a different way.
I've watched time-lapse footage of various types of plants. Usually just say, for example, on a nature documentary on the television. And when you see some of that, it suddenly becomes very, very obvious how alive plants can be in a way that we don't think of them. Mm-hmm. If you take, the activity of a flowering plant over a 24-hour period and, film it and then speed it up so it takes 1 minute or 30 seconds, I don't know if it's quite instructive really to look at that, because it's really quite eye-opening. It becomes, well, yes, of course these things. We look at the movements, the changes that go on, the interaction with its environment. It really is quite stunning.
It is, and they're interacting with their environment on a chemical level. In terms of watching a runner bean try and find a post to lean on is amazing. It seeks out its spatial environment and is very aware of that environment that seeks out the right post in order, to have its stable growth. But they also, plants can see. Many people aren't aware of the fact that they can see their environment. They can see ultraviolet waves, which we can't see. They're also able to see into the near and far infrared spectrum. They have magnetic sensitivity in the same way that birds do. So, all of their senses are profound. Their ability to hear and respond to what they hear has been proven to not be imaginary, the music of the plants. Many people have really had a hard time with plant hearing, but recent studies have appeared in Nature magazine, and it's finally being accepted that plants do in fact hear. And of course they communicate with their chemistry profoundly. So plant senses are really revealing the extent to which plants engage with their environment and respond to their environment, which inherently shows that sense of self and other. When there's a sense of self and other, there's definitely consciousness.
In terms of plants not having a brain per se, I mean, you mentioned, that sort of how quantum physics particularly is revealing the illusory nature of our brains as we have been trained to think of them. I think of plants more in a collective sense. I mean, I've read some fascinating material about interconnected root systems.
Yes, the mycorrhizal networks.
Yeah, in collections of plants, and there's one, is it somewhere in North America, something like the biggest root system in the world, covering however many square miles, and how these things function. I mean, again, it's staggering, and it's something I don't think most of us come into contact with this information.
Now, the mycorrhizal networks were discovered by a scientist in British Columbia, University of British Columbia, and what she discovered was that the trees actually communicate through their root systems through fungal networks. So they are able to actually share nutrients and information with one another through these fungal networks. And not only can they share information and nutrients, but in times of hardship, they actually show a preference communicated through the fungus to their own progeny, their own saplings, and other plants directly related to them. But they have a wonderful capacity to give and share nutrients and information interspecies. So you can get networks that expand across an entire forest communicating through these mycorrhizal fungal networks.
Another thing that we're learning, as I say, since the dawn of the quantum age really, is the interconnected nature of human consciousness and how that functions collectively and in some ways can be like a network. Sort of we're all connected. It's a bit of a cliche these days. It's coming out of New Age circles, but there's an analogy there really with the plant consciousness idea, and we can then expand that out into our interactions with animals as well as plants. And I mentioned at the top of the interview about Earth as a holistic system. So this idea of ourselves as discrete individuals is quite misleading. Yeah, very much so.
That's right. Actually, human beings, to the extent that we evolved on Earth, which is not a given fact, have evolved within the field of plant consciousness. And actually, without plants, we couldn't have evolved very much at all. It's not only that plants have given us food and medicine, they've also provided shelter. I mean, even the paper and pens that helped humankind to expand onto a new level of communication and understanding that came from the plant world. There is very little that we could have done as human beings on Earth without the cooperative support of the plant world. And animals the same. They arrived on the planet when the conditions for their survival were met, and it was plants that created that environment that made it possible for them to survive and thrive and cover the world as we as humans also have done. So this relationship with the plant world, truly we should be thanking and respecting them, and instead what we have is this sense of separation that plants are dispensable. I mean, what's happening with the bees, what's happening with the GMOs, what's happening with the fertilizers and herbicides. I mean, actually the mycorrhizal networks are being destroyed by chemical farming. And without those, plants can't absorb nutrients. They actually require fungus in the soil in order for the plants to provide nutrient-dense food. So we're actually doing a lot of harm to ourselves by harming the plant world and our environment as a whole. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I think more and more people are becoming conscious of this relationship and the fact that we are codependent and need to respect one another.
Well, you mentioned what's happening with bee populations there, and I've read quite a lot about this over the last couple of years, and mostly along the lines of severe bee die-off. And I've also read some stuff kind of refuting it, saying there's no problem with bee population, but without getting into the politics of it, because it's a bit like climate change. There's all sorts of reasons why people write papers or write articles in these areas, and quite often nothing to do with, or little to do with, what's actually happening on the ground. But the whole bee pollination relationship is kind of it's one of the, if not the best example of how this interdependent system functions, and how disrupting one part of it can have a huge knock-on effects. Because if their function in pollination is widely disrupted, that has huge effects for actually our ability to feed ourselves.
Yes, it certainly does, and especially to feed, ourselves, and also the animals are dependent upon it too. So actually, with human beings required flowering plants in order to survive in the world, and only arrived after flowering plants had established themselves here. So it's absolutely vital. I mean, our food, our medicine, and that of animals. So even if you consume meat as part of your diet, you're still dependent upon the plant world.
Well, yeah, of course, because we feed. I can't remember. I've read some horrendous statistics about how much corn or whatever it is that you're going to be feeding cattle. Sorry, I did work on a farm once, but it didn't have animals on it, so I'm not totally up on what we feed animals. But I mean, the amount of input there is, for example, to get a kilo of beef.
That's crazy, especially in a world where we claim to be concerned about feeding the masses. It's just provides so much land for growing food for cattle is just insanity, really. But here we are. Definitely that is something that's going to have to change in the future.
Just a quick aside, while you mentioned it a moment ago about flowering plants, this is something that's, in evolutionary terms, is a bit of a conundrum about how they developed.
It's the great unknown. I mean, but that's true of every stage of the development of plant life and animal life. Although theories have been strung together, we actually have many different forms of plant life that have evolved quite independently with no shared ancestry. And it's basically the earliest plants created the environment for the next level of plants to survive, but there's no ancestry between them. And then those plants created the soil that made it possible to have plants with roots, and then again no shared ancestry between them. And all the way through to flowering plants that appeared out of nowhere and very rapidly covered the earth. And again, although we can theorize, we don't have an actual factual link between these different levels of evolution of plant life.
My layman's take on it is that with a flowering plant, the plant depends on the flower to reproduce itself.
Yes.
So how would the flower evolve?
Yes, Darwin said the great mystery.
Yeah.
And the great mystery it remains. I actually really have a different take on evolution. We arise from consciousness, that matter takes on the form of consciousness, and that it's a fractal process, and it's a process through both space and time. So materially arriving, having a physical body is preceded by having an emotional body, which is preceded by having a mental body. So that the physical body only was attained once the environment was prepared, and that it wasn't dependent upon this kind of physical bridge of genetic link or evolutionary link with previous species.
Just thinking back, and we talked about our codependence and interdependence with plants going back since the dawn of anatomically modern humans, and well, obviously prior to that as well. Our relationship obviously changed a great deal over the millennia to the point where we're at now, that I mentioned a few moments ago, is like most things on the earth, it's just a resource for us to plough through as quickly as possible. I mean, when you look at indigenous traditions, and of course this is very relevant today in terms of thinking of traditional healing methods, plants weren't just a vital source of food. I mean, before pharmaceuticals came along and artificial created in the lab chemicals and pills to pop day and night, plants were, I mean, not just in terms of nutrition and diet, but, if you sustained a cut or an injury, obviously there's some things that no amount of plant medicine can help with, but that was the medicine cabinet, really, was Mother Nature.
That's right. And there's always been a very strong link throughout history and traditional medicine between consciousness and the physical body, and the relationship between plant healing and consciousness. In Ayurvedic medicine, you have the three gunas, which are sattvic, rajasic, and tamastic. And most plant life comes under the sattvic, which is about inner contentment, mental health, emotional balance, spiritual leanings. In modern terms, you would call right hemisphere dominance. Contentment, really. And this comes from foods that are high in prana. And, of course, these are the living foods, the fruits and vegetables, the nuts and seeds. And the nervine herbs that support the nervous system, come under the sattvic category. And in the rajasic, which is stimulating and activating, most medicinal herbs come under this category. So it's like this progression of physical, emotional, mental in that process. Tamastic is when it's eating meat, it's this whole process of thinking negative thoughts, and so it comes back to food again, what we take into our bodies. With tamastic, it's about alcohol, meat eating, any form of obtaining food that harms another person or harms the environment. So, for example, GMOs would come under that category. Anything synthetic comes under that category, including pharmaceutical drugs. And with the tamastic state, you develop anger, resentment, hatred, a closed mind, very left hemisphere approach towards perceiving the world around you. So when you're in a tamastic state, you're in a very sort of concentrated, stiff, tight, dark, you could call it a very small box way of thinking of the world, and that tension in the body creates disease. The rajasic, which is the herbs and activating principle, actually shakes you out of that very tight space where toxic disease is possible. It creates cleansing in the body and starts getting energy moving again in the body. And the goal is always towards this sattvic state, which is the pure living foods, fruits and vegetables. And in this state, it supports spiritual life and the evolution of consciousness. So this concept of the relationship between food and consciousness goes way, way back in history. That certainly predates written history. And similar concepts are part of traditional systems around the world, including the Tibetan systems in South America, the Aboriginal Australian views of the relationship between diet and consciousness. It pops up everywhere. The Native Americans as well, same concepts. And the Cherokee have wonderful creation myths that revolve around man's descent into moving away from a very pure vegetable-based diet and creating disease in the body and an essential war within the world, because through harming animals, through harming your environment, you create conflict inside, within, and also without. So it's all connected, really.
I'm just throwing this in because suddenly something you said made me think of it. It's not just another little cul-de-sac, but across the road here where I live, there's a patch of ground I suspect one day they'll build something on it, but for many years it's just been vacant lot. And obviously nature has taken over in there. I haven't been across to have a good look at what's in there, but every now and again I see someone stop, stare into the greenery and start picking things. And sometimes they put them straight in their mouth, so I suspect there's some berries over there. But the reason I mention it is because for every one person who does that maybe once a month, there are half a dozen passers-by who look at them like they're insane. Like, what are they doing? Are they eating leaves? What could they possibly be doing? Whereas I'm old enough to remember, as a child, picking berries just straight from a hedgerow. And as long as they haven't got, how can I put it, bird doings on them, you probably don't need to wash them. They're probably going to be okay. So it's just interesting how the idea that our fruit and veg grows in trees, in orchards, that grows in the fields, that's outside. But the idea that there could be something unregulated, uncontrolled, and actually wild that you could take for free, put in your mouth and get something good from is alien to a lot of people, I think.
I think you're right. I think people have really disassociated themselves from their source of food. And it's not just their source of food. It's, you live in a house and you've got the heat and the AC, you've got all those comforts of home. And all of your source of your needs, you imagine coming from the world of man. You go to the supermarket when you want food. You go to the doctor when you want medicine. You go to the school when you want education. And in the past, man didn't have that relationship with nature, and they were much more self-sufficient and very conscious of the environment that was providing them with their basic needs. Packaged food can be, it's so sad when you see, it happens with most children at some point when they realize that the hamburger on their plate is a cow. And many of them cry, and the parents are, oh, it's okay. They're here to feed us, and they don't mind dying for your meal, for example. But there's that moment of shock that children have that then, you become conditioned to accept that that's the way things are and that's the way they're meant to be. And many people are taught that that animals are there for that purpose as well. And when it comes wrapped in plastic, it's very hard to relate to the reality that brought it to your plate as well.
I even saw something on a news item not that long ago about children and what they knew about food, and thinking that chips, or for the US audience, fries, came from a chip factory, as opposed to it was a potato that had been diced up, So, I mean, even
You're
at that...
lucky these days if it is a potato that's been diced up.
Well, yeah.
Goodness knows what they really are, It's true. I saw one of children not recognizing what a tomato was.
Yeah, it's rather unfortunate to say the least. Thinking about, you're talking about disconnection from the natural environment. There's quite a lot of emphasis at the minute on, I mentioned at the top of the hour, about gentrifying urban spaces. But of course, even the flowering plants or the trees that are introduced to city spaces, those have been done by humans, and it tends to be quite designed and laid out. We just think you go into most parks in city centres, certainly in this country anyway, and it's very controlled. Even attempt to make it look random, like say for example on a golf course, you go there and they've tried to make it look like it's kind of all just, Mother Nature did this. It's not. It is very, very different from just finding yourself miles from anywhere in the centre of the woods. It's just, we still bring this controlled consciousness to bear when we're trying to sort of green an urban space.
It's true. That's one of the reasons why I love permaculture so much. If you're going to cultivate food, there is that man-plant relationship. It's not going to be as it is out in nature. But with permaculture, there's a real consciousness of the relationships between the plants, that they support one another, and that it is an ecosystem. And it's an attempt to come close to replicating an environment in nature, while still producing a large amount of food per acre. But there's nothing quite like nature itself, that's for sure. Spent some lovely time in the Himalayas and places like that, very, very far from civilization, and it's a powerful experience, and your body feels it, your emotions feel it. It's a holistic experience, spending time in nature like that.
We've created huge problems. This is related to a couple of things that we've talked about with these monoculture farms, where you have hundreds, sometimes thousands of acres with one crop. And obviously in the US, you've got much bigger, and other, Australia, for example, South America, you've got much more scope to have farms of that sort of scale. Here in the UK, not so much so, but even here over the last 200 or 300 years, hedgerows have been disappearing as individual fields have increased in size. And this monoculture is a very, very damaging way, ultimately, to grow food. And yes, it's worked for a while, but because it's been dependent on fertilizers and replacing nutrients in the soil, and when you've had problems with invasive insect species, trying to poison them or whatever it happens to be, but it's not sustainable.
No, it's not sustainable. Actually, I've driven across the U.S. in a car 3 times in my life, and the first time was in the mid-'80s. And I drove from Colorado to Seattle, from Seattle to Maine, and back to Colorado. So I was driving across a lot of agricultural land. And on that first trip across the U.S., I had to stop at every petrol station along the way to clean my windscreen. And I'm feeling so sad because I don't like to kill those poor, insects. But, it was just incredible with my windshield wipers going, every 10 minutes and like that. And there was a patchwork of farms across the country. And you would get fields of one thing, fields of another. There was still a lot of monoculture, but there was still a variety. And there were also little farm shops along the way where you could pick up your fruits or vegetables. By the late 80s, I did the same, or it might have been 2000, I did the same journey across America, this time from Maine to Colorado and then to California. And the difference was phenomenal. The monoculture had really taken over. It's miles and miles and miles of the same plant and very little in the way of insects. And then I did this one more time 3 years ago, and I drove all the way across the entire country without cleaning my windshield once. All of this in the summer, all the same season. And when I got to California, I sat at the beach in Laguna Beach, and there was not a bird in sight. No sound. The entire time I was in Laguna Beach, I was in an area with nature, with trees and bushes, and I didn't get woken up one morning to the sound of bird calls. It was completely gone. So it was a massive change. It was actually, and all of the little shops along the way that were selling produce, all gone. And it was just field after field after field of corn, actually. Some wheat, almost all corn. And in addition to that, at one point along the journey, I was driving, I saw this big, huge, windowless building to my left, and I'm driving, and I'm driving, and I'm driving, and it's still there, this building. So finally, I stopped off at a petrol station, and I was like, what was that enormous building? It took, on a motorway, driving fast, it took 10 minutes to pass it. And it was a chicken farm, I guess you would call it, or factory. Is really a dreadful environment. Couldn't even imagine how many chickens were in there. And what a dreadful life in the complete dark. There wasn't a single window in the entire space. So it was actually quite a shocking experience driving across the U.S. I won't do it again. It was very, very disturbing. And to imagine that the consequences long-term of that level of destruction of a natural ecosystem covering so many hundreds and thousands of miles. And it affects the whole world. It's not just that environment, because these things have a cascading effect on nature as a whole. So we all pay the price for that kind of, I guess it's an attempt to control the environment. And then the corn itself is mostly inedible. It's GMO corn, which turns into corn syrup and all of these products that go into processed food. You can't actually eat it, not directly. So, and of course the knock-on effects to people's health. So it's kind of a ecological nightmare for the plant life, for the animal life, for the insects, and for us as human beings as well.
Well, I've had Scott Tipps from the National Health Federation on here before, and I didn't have him on to have him convince me of anything because I was already sceptical about GMOs, and not for any politically correct reason, or indeed not for any political reason. I'm not anti-business per se, anything like that. I'm not anti-profit per se. But having looked at it, I think that not only has it not been tested, this is not something I think that we can tinker with for a few years and then just say, right, we're good to go, and then unleash that same model across all sorts of plant and animal species. But I don't think that it holds out the promise that its advocates say that it does, which is like, this is the only way to feed the world. I think that is not the case whatsoever. I think it's just quite simply driven by other selfish agendas.
Yes, I agree with you. And the only studies that are independent studies that aren't by the companies like Monsanto themselves, independent studies have shown are the only ones that have been done for any length of time. The longest study that had been done up until a couple of years ago was only 90 days on the effects of eating GMOs. And then there was a study in France that was done over a 2-year period, and all of the rats developed organ enlargement and cancer and severe abdominal swelling, and it was a disastrous outcome of taking GMO food over the course of 2 years. Of course, they were viciously attacked, and for producing the study, and it was claimed that it wasn't a valid study, but it was actually at that point the only independent study that had ever been done. And people imagine that these products have been proven to be safe, and it has not been the case at all.
It's completely contrary to this. Well, I was going to say popular view. It's not necessarily popular. It's just got a lot of lobbyists behind it, and now politicians, that GMO is somehow the only global way forward. It's not borne out on all sorts of levels. But if you look back in the past about how small scale farming was actually how people were fed, and people will sometimes counter and say, oh yes, but the world's very different now. Sort of 7 billion and counting, and this is just, we can't have these little small diverse farms. When you look somewhere like India, now of course there's enormous pressures being brought to bear in a country like that from corporations, mostly outside of India, to change their farming system. Mm-hmm. But much of India is still being fed by small farmers. The same applies in Africa, in China. But as I say, unfortunately, there's enormous disruption going on there at the minute, trying to change that into big monoculture farms.
Mm-hmm. Actually, the UN has recommended small farming as the answer to feeding the world's population. So what we have is a situation that corporations are pushing their agenda for profit, but the science and the studies don't support it. But they get, even the UN, when they make a statement like that, they don't get the press. The marketing power that GMO companies have it's profound, and they can affect politics, they can affect public opinion through the media, and it's a delusion. The delusion of GMOs is basically where we're at. But the UN definitely recommends small organic farming. That's what they've concluded with their studies, is that's the most effective way to feed a growing population.
Well, we also have some very similar issues when it comes to pharmaceutical companies, because obviously, as we mentioned earlier about the nature of being the medicine cabinet for most of our history, a lot of seems to me anyway, that a lot of medicines, mass produced or those produced, by pharmaceutical companies, certainly in the early stages, would have been trying to mimic what nature was doing for obvious reasons. There's a certain logic to that. And I don't know how completely detached we've become from that process now, but we see the tremendous pressure on natural healthcare I'm not just talking about things like homeopathy here. I'm talking about herbalism, and in Chinese medicine, for example, and we're in the town here, for example, where I live. You can go and find a Chinese medicine place. There's a couple of herbalists. There's a clinic that specialises in alternative health. That in itself is quite telling, isn't it? Alternative healthcare, because it means not going to the hospital. But that's another money-driven agenda, really, is not only to get all of us popping expensive pills when we have the slightest, twinge or ailment, but also now the manufacturing, which is, completely gone haywire, of conditions, like restless leg syndrome or whatever.
Right, ADHD. That's right.
Yeah.
These are manufactured illnesses, that are basically to sell a product. That's right. What's interesting is that plant healing, whether you're speaking about food, essential oils, flower essences, medicinal herbs, all of the healing processes that come from the natural world are vibrational. And there's an inherent resonance between the physical body, the human body, and the plant world. When a pharmaceutical company comes along, most of their drugs are made as synthetic versions of what's already in a plant. So they seek out what they call the active ingredient of a plant, and then they create a product from this. However, the product is not the plant. It's a man-made version of the active principles, and it doesn't carry the same frequency, and it isn't inherently coherent with the human biology. And then, of course, it has the unwanted side effects. What's so interesting is that pharmaceutical companies actively pursue healing, medicines, whether, mostly herbal medicine, from indigenous communities. They go out to Peru, they go to the Amazon, they go to Tibet and Nepal and India and China, and they seek out the plants. And at the same time, they discredit these same people that they're getting their plant ideas from. They turn around and make a pharmaceutical out of it. This is the grand success of the pharmaceutical industry. And yet, the source of their active ingredients in the plants and the relationship that the plants have to the original healers is ridiculed. Most of the plants that are used as medicine were discovered through direct perception plant communication. So you'll ask an indigenous healer from any of these communities, and you'll ask, how did they know that this plant had this medicine and had this effect on the body? And they'll say that the plant told them. And you can find the same approach to and relationship with the plant world throughout indigenous communities and traditional medicine. So here the plant told them. It's a direct plant-human relationship. And then pharmaceutical companies come in and gather this information and at the same time turn around and say that it doesn't work and deny the relationship of consciousness and communication between the plant and the shamans or the traditional healers that, you could say discovered these, the medicinal qualities of these plants. It's a pretty deceptive twist to the process. The plants is that more than 70% of pharmaceuticals are made from herbal medicines. And in many, many cases in clinical trials, the plants are more effective in treating the disease than the pharmaceutical drugs are, and without the side effects, without the negative side effects.
Well, this is a fascinating area, really, and you kind of read my mind, because I was going to come on to that next about the idea of plants speaking to us. The flip side of that is something I learnt quite early on, because I was always interested in growing plants, not so much, flowers and ornamental plants, but, vegetables and fruits from a very young age. And I was more or less taught, or it was suggested to me, that actually talking to the plants was a good idea, and not reprimanding them, saying, come on, grow faster, but actually, right. But speaking to the plants in a positive, sort of warm and encouraging way. And it sounds absolutely woo-woo. It sounds to some people like total new age nonsense. But I found something, and I can't, how you would quantify anything like this. I think this is one of the problems with a lot of concepts and ideas coming up from the realm of the quantum world and consciousness itself, is that people are saying, well, where's the data, where's the repeatable experiment and all the rest of it. But in terms of intuition and how you feel about something and how that affects your environment, I would just say that in my experience, talking to the plants that you're growing, particularly if it's for food, it feels good, and I've yet to have any plant wither and die catastrophically that I kind of muttered to a little bit when I was watering it, if you see what I mean.
It's a very interesting thing. Plants actually are feeling-based. They're, in terms of mental activity as we recognize it as people, that aspect of themselves is fairly dormant. They're very active on a feeling base. So when you communicate with plants, it is actually through a feeling base. It's not that you're communicating in language. What they understand and respond to is the feeling and the emotion behind the language. And actually, feelings and emotions are something that plants have a profound effect on the human body when we take them, whether essential oils have very much a physical, emotional, and mental effect on the body, as does food, and as does homeopathy. All of the plant medicines are working on these three levels simultaneously. But it's this emotional level that is where the strongest communication is with plants, and you have to be open to a feeling base. The more linear you are, the more mental you are in your approach, the less likely you're going to have that connection. So coming from a heart base, talking to your plants, there's that sense of recognition that here you are with another conscious being, that you're aware of each other, you respect one another, and then the plants respond to that.
We alluded to this earlier on, and we've been talking about diet and its effect on us overall and then on the environment. We've been speaking about the nature of consciousness itself, and bringing these two things together, I think that it's probably a bit of a circular situation, but what we're putting in our bodies has over the long term affected human consciousness. I think if you go back, and this is quite well documented in other areas about how human beings saw themselves differently in millennia gone by, saw their environment differently, didn't see themselves as separate from it. We now have this tremendous sense of separation, and as to which came first, our ideas and thinking about separation, as we thought of ourselves as separate individuals, or as our habits changed, we began to manipulate our environment, diets changed, health changed. I mean, who knows which came first, chicken or egg, but the point is, we're at a very disconnected point now, and of course, we're having this conversation because we're looking to traditions, ideas that have never really gone away, but how maybe to revive some of that, how to become more connected, because there's a tremendous need for it. But the place we're in now is, I see two trends happening. One is negative. It's GMOs, it's pharmaceutical companies, it's a tendency towards people being more obese on one hand and people in other parts of the world struggling to feed themselves at all. And on the other hand, a sort of 11th hour recognition that we need to change this, because with the burgeoning population and burgeoning environmental problems, we can't just have business as usual going forward.
Essentially, I see consciousness as the fundamental aspect of this. And it's to do with degrees of consciousness. When we are in poor health, our poor health manifests not only physically, but also emotionally and mentally. It's a form of weight, if one could say, or veils upon consciousness. So our capacity to perceive things the way they really are, to look into our environment and to see things holistically, is actually reduced through the process of having a physical, emotional, or mental health issue, and that they're all intertwined. So one of the things that plant medicine does is it works in a fractal relationship. It actually alters initial conditions within a person. So you have a progression, And you can be progressing towards health, or you can be progressing towards a disease state. And I speak here physically, emotionally, and mentally. And when the plant comes, frequency enters your frequency, and there's a commingling of these qualities, you actually have new emergent behaviors, and those new emergent behaviors alter your fractal progression. And this doesn't happen just physically, it also happens emotionally and mentally. It's like the removing of the layers of the onion that allow you to perceive the world around you in a clearer way. So as you perceive the world around you in a clearer way, the way in which you treat your body, the way in which you treat the world around you, the way that you treat others actually changes and continues to alter your fractal progression. So it's any aspect of healing is always helping to open your consciousness to a new level of awareness about the world around you and your relationship with it. So when you work with plant medicine, depending on which level you're working with food, it's primarily a physical effect with a long-term effect on consciousness. There are molecules, there are vitamins and minerals, there's effect on the cells of the body, and the coherence in the body changes, which affects your mental life, which affects your emotional life, which affects your mental life, and affects your consciousness. With other aspects of plant medicine, especially essential oils, for example, the effect is coming first, most strongly, on an emotional level. It's actually cleansing receptor sites on the cell membrane, increasing oxygenation to the pineal and pituitary glands, which is really affecting your emotional life and how you perceive the world. They delete incorrect information from the cellular memory, and they restore the correct information. So trauma that lives on in the body is released, and when trauma is released, our perspective of the world completely changes. You're able to see things more holistically, and again, without that reaction, with that burden of carrying our emotional history from the past, we're able to experience life afresh. So essential oils are really coming from this emotional, less on the physical, less on the mental. They're really focused on that aspect of that triangle, if you will, between body, emotions, and mind. And then flower essences are working more on a mental level, with cascading effects through fractal potential on the emotional and then physical body. So it's a combination of the many different approaches of working with plant medicine that, in step by step, actually allows our consciousness the freedom to evolve. So it is like a co-evolutionary process. And then from the plant's perspective, when they're engaging in this process of healing, they could say it's all selfless. But actually, through quantum entanglement, the relationship that we have with the plant is also going to affect their consciousness as well. So it's part of their evolutionary process to work with human beings in this way. We've evolved together and support one another in this co-evolutionary way.
There's also thinking about natural medicine, the kind of placebo effect, I think, is somewhat relevant here, because that in itself, while I don't know if it is in some way connected with natural medicine, but it's certainly got great relevance in terms of, big pharma's supposed solutions, because they'll run their tests and, their trials before they launch a new drug, and they kind of use the placebo effect, but at the same time sort of deny it in one way. And in terms of quantum processes, I think this is fascinating. And in some ways, the placebo effect is almost a misnomer, because placebo, by its definition, doesn't do anything. It's more like a mind effect. It's more like, a mind and body interaction bringing about healing.
Mm-hmm. I actually have great respect for the placebo effect, and it's wonderful. Whatever healing you can get in whatever way you can is wonderful. There are people that have gone under surgery that were placebo surgeries, that were unable to walk due to knee injuries, for example, that had a surgery that was not a true surgery, where they actually just opened up the knee and fiddled around and then closed it back up again. And they went on to be able to play basketball with their grandchildren, and that's fantastic. So if, that aspect of the power of the mind in terms of healing is never to be underestimated. It's very important. And so I believe that the placebo effect is a very valid part of the healing process. I just think it's a very dismissive name for it. That this association as if it's nothing. It's not nothing. It's the power of the mind, and the mind is a very powerful thing.
What's your take on so-called invasive plant species versus or vis-a-vis all the disruption that humankind has caused, by inadvertently or deliberately transporting different plant species around the world to places where they wouldn't naturally have been had they been left to their own devices. Bane of my life as a plant grower has been in the UK, has been Japanese knotweed. And so I just don't know what your thoughts are on all of that.
Well, I do know that whatever species you're speaking about, there's a lot of travel around the world. And people have been sailing around the world for many thousands of years and populating new areas, and it changes the landscape of an area. In fact, they found that sailing, for example, has happened far, far earlier than previously thought. We have the Egyptian carvings in Australia, for example, that are amazing. It's amazing how long man has had this urge to travel. And I think that plants have a similar relationship of, it's not the urge to travel, although they do in their own ways travel the world, but when man places a plant in a new environment, that plant will find a way or try to find a way to make a home there, but it changes everything. You have new frequencies interacting with one another, and it will change the environment. Whether it's for the better or for the worse in the long run, who are we to judge? But invasive plants definitely can take over environments, dramatically change the local environment, and the plants that already are established there. So I know that this can be quite sad when we're attached to the plants that are in our environment and want to maintain that clarity within the ecology of that environment. But it's interesting how when two different qualities of consciousness come together, they do in fact make a third new quality. And this certainly happens with cultures as different people from different parts of the world have traveled into new areas and they've brought new ideas, and a new culture emerges that's a combination of what was there before and what has come into it. In India, they've developed a language that's basically a combination between Hindi and British English, and they've taken off in a whole new direction. And so is that not a good thing, that India isn't purely India and England isn't purely England anymore? Seems to be that this exchange of ideas, exchange of energies is something that is a natural process in the world. And it has its positive and its negative outcomes depending on your perspective, how you look at it.
Well, we're talking about this co-evolutionary process and a sort of a reconnection with the natural world, and I sometimes find it's, a little odd and even jarring sometimes when commentators or writers talk about the natural world as something that's out there, it's outside the window or it's outside the city. But of course, we are part of, like it or not, and have always been part of the natural world. And I'm not one of these people who can subscribe to humanity being a plague or a cancer on the face of the earth. I can't buy that. It insults my intelligence and my intuition as well.
And I don't buy that either.
However far off track many of us might be, I think that we're still part of a process here of evolution on this planet, and by hook or by crook, whether we do it voluntarily or whether we are forced to do it, we will find a way to integrate better into this system, and life will go on. And it doesn't mean that 100 years from now, 10,000 years from now, there might not be another huge disruption and displacement, but life goes on, and ultimately one day maybe life will be extinguished, the sun will go supernova, whatever. But I think that we're part of a system here, by one way or another, and life finds a way, and we're part of it, and the sooner we recognize ourselves as such, the better.
Yes, I agree with that. I mean, civilizations rise and fall, and ways of thinking rise and fall as well. In the East, in the Hindu belief, civilization and consciousness goes through cycles, and that it's a natural process. And they really equate suffering with growth. So as we go through periods of intensity, such as we are going through now, that it's actually a process of accelerated growth that we learn from the suffering. And that when things are all too easy, that we don't grow at the same pace, and we become quite comfortable and quite lazy in our development as conscious beings. So I think there's an element of real positivity for each individual with what's going on in the world right now. And I think it's good to hold on to that understanding that it's the challenges in life that make us think and make us explore our reality and help us to determine what's really important to us, what our values are. And I really do see that in the world right now, that there are many people that are realizing how important community is with this incredible isolation, with television and mobile phones and internet dating, for example. That sense of, wait a minute, where is my human contact? Where is that, love that I know I need? And but that's happening on multiple scales in many, many facets of life, the doctor-patient relationship, in the educational systems, certainly in our relationship with nature. And as people get clear on what they're missing, then they can rebuild within themselves and in their communities and their families and start focusing on what's really important. After all, I think this obsession that we've had for quite some time now, in terms of the success of the individual and material success, is losing its luster. And people are ready for change. And if it took suffering to get there, I think that was a worthy price, really, to pay for the opportunity to evolve as individuals and as a community.
Wonderful. Well, Bonny, today we've been talking about the plant world, our relationship as a species with it, and how all of that interconnects and affects everything else. In closing, tell listeners about your website or websites. Also, you'll shortly be part of the forthcoming Plant Consciousness Conference here in the UK. So tell folks about those and anything else you'd like to share.
Oh, yeah, I've had a school for many, many years. I've been teaching since 1987. And my school has essentially a natural physician course, a naturopathy course, and individual courses on healing diets and herbal medicine, with a focus on a very holistic approach to mind-body healing, and has evolved into approach this quantum botanicals that is really about using all the different approaches towards plant medicine to evolve in consciousness and really understand that mind-body connection in the healing process. So it's a very vibrational understanding of plant medicine and plant healing and the co-evolution between humans and the plant world. So I offer courses online, and I offer summer immersions and classes in the UK and in the US. And that's been a great road. I've enjoyed that process. I've got students around the world. My website is herenowhealing.com. And upcoming, I am invited to present at Plant Consciousness. That talk will be about plant senses and quantum understanding of matter and how that relates to evolution of consciousness using plant medicine. So that should be wonderful. There's many wonderful speakers over that last weekend in September, so it's just around the corner. It should be a very exciting weekend for everyone that attends.
Splendid. Well, Bonny, thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
Oh, thank you, Greg, and thank you for inviting me.
Well, folks, that's it for another week. As ever, thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, check out the website, which is legalizefreedom.com. That's legalize-freedom.com, where you'll find an archive of programs offering alternative views on a wide range of topics, including politics and economics, energy and environment, culture, spirituality, history, and the nature of reality. You can also browse and buy a range of publications from our guests, and if you're feeling generous, make a donation to help keep the site up and running. Based on current audience numbers, if everyone who tuned in donated just 5 pence per show, that's about 8 cents US, this could become a full-time, fully funded operation, offering more and more often. During October 2014, over 50,000 of you streamed or downloaded at least one show. Total donations were £7 UK, which currently converts to about $11 US. Whether you listen, donate, or do both, I greatly appreciate your support. Until next time, I'm Greg Moffat, and you've been listening to legalizefreedom.com.